Ever heard about a queen who used a person as a chair just to prove a point?
Just sounds like a power move.
Yeah, and we're going to dive deep into her story today.
All right, I'm ready.
We're talking about Queen Njinga
Nzinga.
of Ndongo and Matamba in what's now Angola.
Okay. 17th century, right?
You got it.
Fighting off European colonialism.
Exactly.
Her story is wild.
Absolutely wild. And it all starts with her name,
Oh, yeah.
Njinga,
Nzinga.
in the Kimbundu language.
Mm-hmm.
Means to twist and turn, almost like it predicted her whole life.
Interesting. So how did she get started on this twisting and turning path?
Well, she was born into a royal family,
Okay, so a princess.
but becoming queen, that was a whole other story.
Forgot.
See, her father was the king of Ndongo, but her mother was an enslaved woman.
So not your typical royal family dynamic.
Not at all. But the king really saw Nzinga's potential,
So what did he do?
gave her an education in politics, even military strategy.
Whoa, that's pretty unusual for a woman back then.
It was. Like, he knew she was destined for leadership.
Even though women didn't usually rule in Ndongo.
Yeah. But things got really complicated with her brother, King Mandy.
I was wondering about him. What happened?
Well, there are these stories about him killing Nzinga's son,
Uh-huh.
possibly out of fear for the throne.
Oh, wow.
And there are even accounts of him forcibly sterilizing her, again, probably to prevent any rivals.
It's just brutal. How did she even recover from that?
It's almost unimaginable, right?
Yeah.
But Nzinga, she was a survivor. She fled Ndongo for a while, but years later, her brother actually asks her to return.
Come back after all that.
It's wild, right? But he needed her.
Needed her for what?
He needed her diplomatic skills.
Yeah.
The Portuguese were becoming a major threat, and he wanted to negotiate with them.
And Nzinga, she was known for her intelligence, and she spoke fluent Portuguese.
Exactly. So he sent her as his ambassador.
Mm.
And this is where that famous human chair story comes in.
Okay, so tell me about that. I've heard bits and pieces, but I need the full picture.
All right, so picture this. Njinga arrives for the meeting with the Portuguese governor.
Hmm.
He's sitting in this big fancy chair.
Symbol of his authority.
Exactly. Expecting her to kneel before him, like a sign of submission.
But Nzinga wasn't about to do that?
No way. She gestures for one of her servants to kneel down, and she sits right on their back, negotiates with the governor like they're equals.
Wow, that's a power move for the ages.
Right. Shows you how she understood power dynamics.
Hmm.
Refused to be treated as inferior.
So smart. What happened with the negotiations? Did it work?
She managed to get a peace treaty,
Okay, that's something.
but it didn't last. When her brother was exiled, the treaty fell apart. And the Portuguese, they went back on the offensive.
So all that work for nothing.
Well, in a way, yeah. But this is where things get even more interesting, because this is when Njinga goes from diplomat to warrior queen.
All right, now we're talking. How does that happen?
When her brother dies, Njinga is supposed to take the throne.
Right, rightful heir.
But she faces a lot of resistance.
From who?
The nobility? Some want to just give in to the Portuguese. Others, they just don't want a female ruler.
Oh, wow. So she's getting it from all sides.
Yep. She ends up having to flee Ndongo again. And then she makes this really surprising alliance.
Who does she team up with?
The Imbangala.
Who are they?
They were these fierce warriors, known for their military skills and, honestly, their brutality.
So pretty risky move.
Oh yeah, a huge gamble. But she needed them. If she wanted to reclaim her throne and protect her people from the Portuguese, she needed their strength,
So she's building her own army.
basically.
Yeah.
And she doesn't just command them from afar, she trains with them, learns their tactics, becomes a skilled fighter herself.
So all that military training from her father really paid off.
Totally. And with this new power, she sets her sights on a new goal.
Okay, I'm hooked. What does she do next?
She conquers the kingdom of Matamba.
Wait, Matamba, wasn't that where she went when she had to flee?
You got it. The same kingdom. By taking it, she creates this powerful base, ready to launch her campaign to take back Ndongo.
This woman is amazing. What a comeback story. Does she get Ndongo back?
She does. And she does it in style. With her Imbangala army, she marches back into Ndongo and reclaims her throne. Unites both Ndongo and Matamba under her rule.
Incredible. Imagine that. After everything she'd been through in her 40s, she finally becomes the queen.
And she ruled for another 4 decades, constantly battling the Portuguese and anyone else who challenged her.
Wow, talk about perseverance. But remember, she's doing all this in a world where women weren't supposed to be rulers, let alone warrior queens.
You're right. It's mind-blowing. And that leads us to one of the most fascinating parts of her story, her decision to become a man.
Okay, I've heard about this. What does that even mean in this context? Did she actually transition, or was it more symbolic?
It was mostly symbolic. But it had real consequences. In Ndongo society, being a leader was a man's job. Women weren't supposed to be in charge, especially not leading armies.
So how does she overcome that?
She started acting like a man. She dressed like one carried weapons, even had male concubines.
Male concubines. That's a new one. What was the thinking there?
Well, some say it was about flipping the script, showing her dominance in a male-dominated world.
It's definitely a detail that makes you think. Makes you realize how different things were back then.
You're so right. It's easy to judge the past by today's standards, but we have to try to see things from Nzinga's perspective.
For sure. But what's undeniable is that she used every tool she had to hold on to power and protect her people. And becoming a man was a way to make sure people accepted her as their leader.
It's just incredible.
Yeah.
She was a military genius, a political mastermind, and a total rule breaker. But I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing for her.
Sadly, no. She faced a lot of pain and loss. We've talked about her son and her brother's betrayal, but there was more.
What else happened?
She lost her sister Kifuji.
What happened to her?
She was kidnapped by the Portuguese and then drowned.
Oh, no.
Either by suicide or as a way to defy them. She didn't want to be used against Nzinga.
That's heartbreaking. It just reminds you that she was a real person, not just some legend.
Exactly. She went through so much, but she never let it stop her. She just kept fighting, and she left behind an incredible legacy.
And you can't talk about her legacy without talking about the slave trade. It's a tough topic, but it's really important to understanding her story.
You're right. It's a complex issue that's often oversimplified.
So what was Nzinga's role in the slave trade?
It's complicated. She owned slaves, and she worked with the Portuguese in the slave trade, probably to stay in power and protect her kingdom. But then later on, you see her fighting the system. She gave refuge to escaped slaves and even fought against the Portuguese slave traders.
So she was basically stuck in a system she couldn't control, making tough choices to try and keep her people free.
Exactly. It's a difficult part of her story. It makes you think about how challenging those times were.
It's why her story is still so relevant today. She's a reminder that things aren't always black and white.
Absolutely. She was a product of her time, but she also pushed the boundaries.
She was a brilliant strategist, a warrior, and a revolutionary, but also a woman who had to make really hard choices.
That's what makes history so interesting, right? It's not simple. It's messy and full of contradictions.
Yeah, well said. Before we move on to the next part of her story, is there anything else about Nzinga's early life and how she came to power that you think our listeners should know?
I think the most important thing is that she never gave up on her vision. For her people and her nation, even with all the challenges, she never lost sight of that. She was a true visionary, a leader who understood that real power is about adapting, strategizing, and fighting for what you believe in, even when it seems impossible.
That's such a powerful message, and it's something we can all learn from.
Totally. Nzinga's story reminds us that we're all capable of incredible things, even when things get really tough.
What do you think, listener? What's standing out to you so far about Queen Nzinga's journey? Was it her cleverness, her resilience, or her unwavering determination? Hold on to those thoughts as we continue to unpack her remarkable story in the next part of our deep dive. Back again with the incredible Queen Nzinga.
She was a master at adapting to survive.
Totally. Like her alliances with the Dutch. It's kind of crazy, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't think she'd team up with another European power while she was fighting the Portuguese.
Right. It seems counterintuitive. But can you break that down for us?
For sure. So remember, the Dutch West India Company, they were big rivals with the Portuguese. Both wanted to control the slave trade and grab land in Africa. Nzinga saw an opportunity.
To play them off against each other.
Exactly. She made a deal with the Dutch, gave them access to slaves and resources, and in exchange, they helped her fight the Portuguese.
Smart move. Gave her a real advantage.
It was brilliant. And she didn't just play the political game, she used religion too.
You mean her conversion to Christianity?
Yep. At first it was to appease the Portuguese, helped her secure that peace treaty we talked about. But later she became Catholic and even got the Pope on her side.
Wow, why the switch to Catholicism?
It gave her legitimacy on the world stage. The Pope was super powerful back then.
So she was thinking long term. Always a few steps ahead.
She was incredible, a true master of strategy.
So let's talk legacy. How is Queen Nzinga remembered today in Angola and beyond?
She's a national hero in Angola, a symbol of resistance against colonialism.
That makes sense. Fighting to protect her people and her land from a much stronger force. It's a story that resonates everywhere.
Definitely. She's on Angolan money. There are statues of her, and she was a huge inspiration during Angola's fight for independence in the 20th century.
That's amazing. Centuries later, her fight was still inspiring people.
That's the power of her story. The fight for freedom is timeless, and her impact goes beyond Angola. She's an icon across Africa for women's empowerment and strategic leadership.
We often hear about her as this fearless warrior queen, but we've also seen she was pragmatic and knew how to compromise. How do we reconcile those two sides?
That's what makes her so interesting. She was a complex person like all of us. She made tough choices in impossible situations, and those choices make her story so captivating.
It's like that with a lot of historical figures. The ones who really made a difference weren't just heroes or villains.
Right, they're complicated people making decisions that are hard to understand from where we sit now.
And that's why we study history, to try to understand the context and the motivations.
Exactly. Helps us make sense of the world today.
Okay, so reflecting on Queen Nzinga's reign, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first, resilience. Njinga faced so much hardship, personal tragedies, betrayals, constant war, but she never gave up. She never stopped fighting for what she believed in.
We can all learn from that.
For sure. She shows us how strong the human spirit can be, how we can overcome even the darkest times.
She also shows the power of thinking strategically and being able to adapt. She was always assessing the situation, changing her plans, making alliances, even with unlikely partners to reach her goals.
She was amazing. She understood that to survive, especially in such a chaotic world, you had to be flexible and willing to adapt.
And she knew her enemy. She understood the Portuguese, their motivations, their weaknesses, and used that to her advantage.
She was a brilliant tactician. Never underestimated her opponents, but never let them scare her either.
And she challenged those traditional gender roles. By becoming a man, she not only showed her authority, but showed other women that they could claim power too.
She broke down those barriers, became a symbol of what women can achieve.
Okay, as we wrap up this part, what stands out to you most about Queen Nzinga's reign and the impact she had?
I'd say it's that balance of strength and diplomacy. She was a warrior, but also a skilled negotiator. She knew when to fight and when to compromise.
That's something every leader needs, right?
Absolutely. True leadership is about having both. Being able to fight when you have to, but also knowing how to find common ground.
So as we move to the final part, to keep that idea of balance in mind, we'll be talking about some of the more controversial parts of Nzinga's legacy, like her relationship with the slave trade and the debates about how she ruled. It's a complicated conversation, but an important one. We're back with a deep dive, and we've been unpacking the incredible life of Queen Nzinga. But like we've seen with a lot of powerful figures, there are some complicated parts of her story, especially her connection to the slave trade.
Yeah, that's something we can't ignore. We talked about how she both took part in it and fought against it. So how do we make sense of that?
It's a big debate among historians. Some say that being part of the slave trade makes her guilty in this terrible system. But others say her later actions to help escape slaves and fighting the Portuguese traders show she was changing her stance.
We have to think about the time she lived in. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrible thing, but it was also a fact of life in 17th century Africa. Njinga didn't create it, but she had to deal with it.
So we can't just say she was pro-slavery or anti-slavery.
Right. It's much more complex than that. We know she owned slaves and worked with the Portuguese in the trade, probably to survive and keep her power. But we also see her pushing back, offering protection to escaped slaves, and even making them part of her army. Later on, she even directly fought against those Portuguese traders.
It's like she was always trying to find a way to resist the Portuguese while also dealing with this awful slave trade. It's a reminder that history isn't simple. Even people we consider heroes can have flaws.
I agree. It's better to acknowledge these difficult parts of her story rather than pretend they didn't happen. It doesn't make her achievements any less impressive, but it shows she was human just like us.
It makes us think about the tough decisions leaders have to make. It's easy to judge looking back, but when you're facing such huge threats, things get a lot more complicated.
Absolutely. That's why we study history, to understand what was happening back then, the motivations, the pressures that influenced the choices people made. It helps us understand the world we live in today.
Apart from the slave trade, some historical accounts, especially from European missionaries, say Njinga was a brutal tyrant. They talk about cruelty, human sacrifices, even cannibalism. How much that is just propaganda and how much is true?
It's hard to separate fact from fiction, especially when the people writing have their own biases. We know European missionaries often demonized African leaders to justify colonialism. They wanted to make them look savage and uncivilized, like they needed Europeans to rule them.
So we should be careful with those accounts.
Definitely. But we also have to remember that power, especially during war, can corrupt people. We can't completely rule out the possibility that Nzinga did some terrible things, just like many rulers in history.
It seems like we have more questions than answers about these controversial parts of her life.
That happens a lot with history. It's okay to accept that uncertainty. It doesn't mean we can't learn from her story. It just means we have to be critical, think about different perspectives, and realize that we may never have the full picture.
That's part of what makes history so interesting, isn't it? It's not just facts and dates, but a whole mix of stories, interpretations, and viewpoints.
Exactly. It's our job to explore all of that, try and understand the past, and learn lessons that can help us today.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Queen Nzinga's life, what's the main thing you want our listeners to take away from this?
The biggest takeaway is that history is complex, and so are people. Queen Nzinga was a brilliant strategist, a fierce warrior, and a symbol of resistance. But she was also shaped by her time, a woman who had to make tough choices, even morally questionable ones, to survive and protect her people. Her story makes us think hard about leadership power and the mark we leave on the world.
Very well said. That's a perfect way to end our exploration of this remarkable woman, Queen Nzinga. We hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as we have.
Keep exploring her story, dig deeper, challenge what you think you know, and come to your own conclusions. That's what history is all about, asking questions, seeking understanding, and connecting the past to the present.
Perfectly put. And here's a final thought for you. If Queen Nzinga were alive today, how do you think she'd see our world? What battles would she be fighting? What alliances would she be making? We'd love to hear your ideas on our social media. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.